Good day, everyone. You are welcome to the virtual inaugural lecture of Animal Welfare Group Nigeria. And today is the 6th in the series of Animal Welfare Group Nigeria virtual inaugural lectures. And today's speaker is Professor Bas Rodenburg from Utrecht University, the Netherlands. Bas will be talking on current advances in poultry welfare from science to practice. So, Bas, we are going to have a short interview with you for 10 minutes. So now I will start with 2 questions. Then Dr. Yase will also ask you 2 questions. If time permits, we can ask some further questions. Bas, I was trying to look at some things that you posted on LinkedIn, maybe yesterday or day before yesterday, and you talk about your new project, a collaborative project funded by European Union, that's Animal Welfare Indicators at the Slaughterhouse. Can you please tell us more about that project?
Yeah, that's fine. And so that's indeed a new project where we look at if we can collect more information in the slaughterhouse. So, for instance, by looking at the carcass, by looking at lesions on the feet, by looking at ear damage, tail damage in pigs. Can we collect information there also with regard to the keeping conditions on the farm? So can we connect the information we can collect in the slaughterhouse with data from the on-farm situation, also looking at welfare aspects of transport and slaughter itself. So also how people are treating the animals, how people are behaving with catching and unloading. But the main focus of the project is actually connecting data sets, connecting data that are already collected throughout the production chain and combining that with data from novel sensors, for instance, by looking at the carcass, by looking at aspects around slaughter, maybe vocalizations, at transport and unloading. So aspects like that. And it's a collaboration between scientists, technology partners that provide the technology needed, and also slaughterhouses themselves.
Oh, that's very lovely. Is it only on pigs? Do you intend to extend it to other animals, some other livestock species?
So the project is focusing on pigs and broilers, so broiler chickens, and the methodology should also be useful for the other species. So we also focus on methodology that you could apply also to cattle, for instance.
Okay, that's very good. So if I may ask this other question, how do you feel when you talk to some other scientists that are working on animal welfare and behavior from developing countries like Nigeria? Do you get excited?
Yes, very much so, because I like it when people start to work in the area and when people show an interest in the topic. So I think it's very useful to learn from each other's perspectives, to learn about animal production in other parts of the world, and to see if we can also share knowledge, share experience, and by that way also improving the lives for farm animals, but also improving production throughout the world. So I think it's very important to share information and knowledge.
Oh, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that. I want to ask this. We know that most of the exotic species have a lot of welfare issues associated with genetic selection. What do you think could be the prospect of the use of the indigenous poultry species?
Yeah, that's also an interesting thought, and I think there's definitely a place for this type of genetics, especially in conditions that are quite challenging, maybe to the commercial hybrids. For instance, the tropical conditions or the very hot climates. Maybe also differences in terms of the feed that's available and the feed quality that the animals might need to deal with. So I think it's very, very relevant to look at local situations and to consider which type of genetics is most suitable for a given country. And in some cases, some of the sort of heritage breeds, can also fit the novel schemes for enhanced welfare. For instance, also like in the broilers with the slower growing genotypes. There's also some more traditional poultry in those type of genotypes. So I think it's very useful to keep an open mind about it and not to focus only on the major brands and breeds that are out there.
And thank you. I would like also to ask, what do you think is the future? Probably if we look at the next 10 years, what will be the future for poultry welfare? In what line do you think it's tending towards?
I think at the moment there's a lot of interest in looking at behavioral possibilities for the birds. So also systems that offer more space and more possibilities for the birds to show behaviors that are very important to them. That's definitely a trend. So also in the laying hens, for instance, towards cage-free systems. In the broilers, also thinking about maybe slower growing genotypes if activity levels are very low, that birds get so heavy that they're hardly able to move around in the system anymore. So developments in that direction I would expect. Also, you see more thoughts about positive experiences, so not only preventing welfare problems, but also thinking about a life worth living and an animal that really can do the things that the animal is motivated to do. I think that's the direction that we are taking. And of course, it also depends on the whole economic situation and the local situation. What is achievable at this point and what may be more in the future. But in general, I think that's the direction that we're headed in.
Oh, that's wonderful.
So thank you very much for that. You talk about measurement of positive affective states. And if I may ask you, what is your perception about that? Do you think positive affective state can really be measured in livestock species or can really be assessed in livestock species?
That is a very good question, because it's not straightforward to really measure emotions. In humans it's difficult, and in animals it's also difficult. One way to approach this is also to look at behaviors that might be indicators of positive affective states, where you can things like foraging behavior, exploration behavior, dust bathing in poultry, rooting in pigs, behaviors that are very important to the animal, and that it's also unlikely to show in a context where it's really stressed and miserable. And so in that way, sort of the behavioral repertoire is very important. And I think also aspects like vocalizations. There's been some really interesting studies showing also that sort of the type of vocalization, but also the intensity of the vocalization can tell us something about the affective state of the animal. And of course, there's work on consumer demand studies. So really asking the animal how he or she is feeling. But that's more an experimental approach. That's not something you can really do on farm yet. But there's a lot of thinking going into this direction. So I'm sure that in the near future there will be additional tools in this area.
That's lovely.
In Nigeria, let me use that as a case study. We really have this wide gap between the industry and the research institute. For instance, I do a lot of research on chicken. He does a lot on turkeys, but we still don't have that connection with the industry as to how we can work together, the synergy, solving some of the welfare issue problems that they're having, and also for them to be able to adopt some of the scientific findings. So I don't know if you can share some ideas about how we can go about this thing, because if we remain disjointed, it seems we are not going to make progress.
No, I think it's very useful to be connected to the industry, also to NGOs and to government, to also hear what are problems that they are struggling with, what are scientific questions that they want answers to. you can start quite small, for instance, with a master student project together to find out a certain topic. You have to get to know each other, to trust each other, to work together. And in that sense, then it can develop into larger projects and into larger collaborations. And I think it's very valuable that scientists can provide information on the facts. So what do you see when you apply a new type of conditions? So and then it depends on society and on industry. How fast this is going forward. I think we have an important role to play here, and in Europe it's quite common to collaborate also with industry, with governments, with NGOs to try and address also the societal issues.
Yeah. So who initiates the move, the scientist or the industry?
It can be both. So often we see questions coming from both directions, and it can also be good to invite people to your institute or to invite them to talks like this to get their interest, and then maybe hear which topics make them are of interest to them. It's investing in exchange and getting to know each other. But also from this meeting, I think you are quite strong in that area with the team from Nigeria. So
I think I will raise that towards the end of the meeting, because there is the possibility for us to have those in the industry as participants. So let's see, maybe from there we'll be able to strike a chord and see how things move on. So
the researchers, the industry, and the government should also be involved also. If you look at what they are doing in Europe, there is industry, there is European Union as government, and there are researchers like Bas. So it should be those three entities, not only industry and researchers. Good day, everybody. I'm happy to be here today. I always look forward to meeting other participants on Animal Welfare Group Nigeria. My name is Samuel Drosharo, and I work with the Department of Animal Breeding and Genetics, Federal University of Agriculture, Abeokuta, Ogun State, Nigeria. I am also a postdoctoral fellow at the Department of Animal Sciences, Purdue University, West Lafayette, Indiana, in the United States. And my area of interest is behavioral genetics. And I've been working on welfare and behavior of turkeys and chickens. I work on fear, aggression, oral-related behavior, comfort, and sometimes sleeping behavior in these two beds. So you are all welcome to Animal Welfare Group Nigeria with acronym AWGN. AWGN was founded in 2019 after a gathering of students and lecturers from Federal University of Agriculture, Abeokuta, Ogun State, Nigeria. And we have three missions in this group. The first one is to increase awareness about animal welfare and behavior in Nigeria, Africa, and the world at large. The second one is to foster collaboration and networking among researchers who are in the field of animal welfare and behavior. And the third one is to educate the public on the importance of animal welfare. And we meet first and third Wednesdays of every month to discuss issues that are related to animal welfare and behavior. And sometimes we have some inaugural lectures like the one we are having today. So people from different parts of the world are presented on issues that are related to ethical practices, slaughtering, fear, stress, cognition, neuroscience, archery practices, open science, big data, behavioral genetics, One Earth, and others in animals. And when I mention animal, I'm talking about livestock species, wildlife, and fisheries and aquaculture. So today's presentation will be the 6th virtual inaugural lecture. And today's presenter is Professor Bas Rodenburg from Utrecht University, Netherlands. Bas will be talking on current advances in poultry welfare from science to practice. And today's moderator is the coordinator of Animal Welfare Group Nigeria in person of Dr. Oluwaseun Iyasere from the Department of Animal Physiology, Federal University of Agriculture, Abeokuta, Ogun State, Nigeria. So I would love to hand over to you, Dr. Iyasere, to continue with the program. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, and thank you for hosting the meeting today. I would like to appreciate everybody for joining us, and first and foremost, appreciate our inaugural lecturer for today, who is Professor Bas Rodenburg. So before he takes his presentation, I would like to take his bio. Bas Rodenburg is a professor in animal welfare at the Faculty of Veterinary Medicine of Utrecht University in the Netherlands. He is also special professor in animal welfare at Wageningen University. He coordinates research and education in animal welfare. The research of Bas aims at improving the methodology for assessment of animal welfare. This also focuses on the use of sensors to monitor behavior and welfare of individual animals housed in social groups. In his own work, Rodenburg advertises one welfare approach in the context of farm animal production to ensure that animal welfare receives appropriate attention in the development of sustainable animal production systems. Bas is involved in the European projects such as the chicken stress, the PPI-LOW, the AVISH, and Best Practice Hen. Best Practice Hen is a demonstration project focusing on disseminating best practices to rear pullets and laying hens in the cage-free system. So join me in welcoming Bas to our meeting. And before we go on with the presentation, kindly note that you're free to drop your questions in the chat box, and we take the questions immediately after his presentation. I believe you find today's meeting interesting. I am Iyasiri Oluwaseun, like I have been introduced. And if you have any question, please drop in the chat box. And towards the end of the meeting, if we can turn it into a discussion forum, please. So we want you to be available. We want you to be around till the end. So if you have further discussions or that you want to that we can do concerning this topic, then we'll have an opportunity to do that. Also in the chat box, kindly introduce yourself. Let us know where you are joining us from. Let us know whether you belong to a researcher, to the industry, or to the government, because we just discussed about the issue of trying to bring these three groups together so we can further make progress in our different countries as regarding poultry welfare. So thank you so much, Bas. We'll be happy to have your presentation. You're welcome.
Thank you, Yasira. Okay, thank you. So I'll talk this afternoon. Thank you very much for inviting me to this meeting. I will talk today about current advances in poultry welfare from science to practice. I'm focusing today on laying hen welfare, also because that's one of the topics that I've worked on throughout my career. We see quite some developments in the laying hens worldwide. We see that they are increasingly kept in cage-free systems, where, of course, the majority in the world is still kept in cage systems. But in Europe, there's a switch going on towards cage-free. Also in other parts of the world, I'll come back to that in my presentation. So that's an aspect that I will talk about today as well. One issue that we see in all laying hen systems is injurious packing. So I'll go into that as well. In cage-free systems, this is actually a problem that is more difficult to control, also because birds are kept in very large groups in those systems. So we'll go into that specifically. So feather packing, injurious packing has been a research topic for me since 1999 until today. So that's something that I've worked on for quite some time. Luckily, the knowledge we have on the topic is really increasing. So it's also about providing this knowledge also to practice and to discuss with practitioners how to improve laying hen housing conditions, management conditions. That is, for instance, something also we do in the Best Practice Hens project. So I just wanted to take you from my own PhD project in the early 2000s to today progress and how we can use that in practice. And so this is a short movie on feather packing behavior in laying hens. You see this one bird going from one to the other in this free-range flock, pecking out feathers, eating the feathers. And you can see many birds with damaged feathers, bald necks, also bellies and backs that have lost feathers. So once birds like this are in the flock and it's really becoming quite severe, it can lead to a lot of damage and also to birds being killed. It's a problem in all housing systems, as I said, but it's most difficult to control in cage-free housing systems because often there are flocks of thousands of birds are kept. In the Netherlands, it's typical to have flocks of 6,000 birds in one compartment, and then, for instance, 5 compartments in the same house. So that makes it more difficult to control problems like this. And birds that you, like the one you saw in the movie, they can make many victims. And for the farmer, it's very difficult to do something once the behavior has developed. So if we look at this behavior in a bit more detail, there's different forms of bird-to-bird pecking and feather pecking. In feather pecking, we distinguish between gentle feather pecking and severe feather pecking. Gentle feather pecking is quite common in young birds during the rearing period, so around between 0 and 17 weeks of age, where they also use it as social exploration. It usually does not lead to much damage, so that is not the major issue. The major issue is really the behavior that I showed in the movie. The severe feather pecking, where feathers are pulled out, sometimes they are eaten by the pecker. And this really leads to damage and to bald areas on the birds. It can lead to tissue pecking that you can see here. So really the skin is damaged and the bird is wounded. And finally, it can result in cannibalism, where really the birds are pecked to death and cannibalized by other birds. A separate form of cannibalistic pecking is vent pecking, where the birds directly target the area around the cloaca and the cloaca itself. And they can pull out the inner organs and then kill the birds quite quickly. And this can also happen in completely well-feathered birds. So this is a bit of a separate issue, but sometimes it is still a problem, this vent pecking, and it can also lead to cannibalism. How many people think that feather pecking is related to the pecking order and to aggression? But in fact, that's not the case. Feather pecking is much more related to exploratory behavior and foraging behavior. If laying hens show aggression, it's always directed at the head and the neck, and it's coming down from the top to the bottom. So often it results in some damage to the comb or to the head, but not to the body or to the. And feather pecking is more directed at the back and the belly area. So those are really separate problems. So if we talk about injurious pecking, it's mainly about these 4 behaviors that we are really concerned. So the severe feather pecking, tissue pecking, vent pecking, and cannibalism. Now, in practice, what is done to reduce the damage by injurious pecking? What is very common throughout the world is beak trimming, where part of the upper beak is removed to reduce the damage. Here you can see the photos from a paper by Jeremy March and Ford and colleagues comparing intact beaks on the left, the top picture on the left, with infrared beak trimming and hot plate beak trimming. Infrared is done at the hatchery, the day of hatching. Hot plate is usually done later during the rearing period. And these both lead to a similar reduction in beak length. And so beak trimming is used to prevent damage. It also, the procedure causes pain for the birds, acute pain, and in some cases also chronic pain if the trimming is too severe and the nerves are damaged. It is under debate in many European countries, also in other areas of the world, also because it's not a real solution. It's basically reducing the damage without really solving the problem. In the Netherlands, it's been prohibited in 2018. So now all our laying hens are kept with intact beaks. And the same is true for a number of countries in Europe. A bit about my PhD project. It's now quite a while ago, almost 20 years that I finished. This was studying the problem of feather pecking. What we were doing was comparing different genetic lines, a high feather packing line and a low feather packing line. These lines were not selected for feather packing, they were commercial selection lines, but at their evaluation in the field, they did see a consistent difference in feather packing between the lines. And we use these lines to study characteristics of feather packers. So if you see birds that show a lot of feather packing, how else can you characterize them? Is it related to fearfulness? Is it related to coping style, to personality traits, things like that? And following that also, how are these individual characteristics related to group performance? And how should we, what type of group would be ideal to limit the risk of feather packing? You see some data from those studies from my PhD. This is a comparison of vocalizations between high and low feather packing birds during the rearing period at around starting around 5 weeks of age. And what we did here was we had this individual test like an open field. You can see the picture on the right here, where we placed birds individually and we monitored their behavior for about 10 minutes. And what you can see in the picture, that if you look at the vocalization patterns, you can see the high feather packing line increasing strongly their vocalization, so sort of sensitizing to the situation, while the low feather packing birds became calmer with age and sort of adapted and habituated to the situation. So here was already a sign that these birds have a very different way of responding to challenges like this. We also studied the relationship between feather packing and fearfulness, and this was done at the individual level. So we looked at really individual high and low feather packers and compared that with their fearfulness responses. So for instance, in this open field test, where you place the bird in the middle and you measure vocalizations and activity in this open field. And the faster a bird starts to vocalize and to move around, the less fearful it is. And what we found there was that birds that were more fearful in this situation, so that showed a lot of freezing in the open field contact at a young age, were more likely to develop feather packing as an adult hen. So in that sense, and we've seen that since then in different studies, especially in the white leghorn birds, where fear and stress sensitivity play an important role. We see it repeatedly that fearfulness at a young age can be a predictor for feather packing at an adult age. And it has been very useful to learn about this. Also in our PhD projects, I worked together with another PhD student, Bas Buitenhuis, and we had one of the first projects where we also estimated heritabilities for feather packing. And we also studied, we estimated genetic and phenotypic correlations with other traits. For instance, the relationship with fearfulness, but also with stress response, for instance. And so this has been very useful in understanding these feather packers better. And Bas Buitenhuis, my colleague, he also was one of the first to do a QTL study, so really to find out which areas of chromosomes of the chicken were involved in this behavior. Also, other scientists have worked on this topic. For instance, Jürgen Kjaer from Denmark, he did an experiment with really lines that were divergently selected on feather packing. So he also had a high and a low feather packing line, and he found in his high feather packing line that these birds that they were more at risk to develop feather packing, and that this was linked to a higher packing motivation in general. And he characterized them almost as hyperactive birds. And so there also seems to be something in that some birds are just more motivated to pack and to manipulate their environment. So that could also be an important area to address with genetic with breeding for reduced feather packing. Well, since then we have collaborated also with one of the breeding companies, with Hendrix Genetics, on reducing feather packing. And an approach that they use is to have families in group cages, and selecting only families that show not so much pecking behavior in these group cages and low mortality level in these group cages, in this group of sisters, because once they know that this family is not showing a lot of pecking to each other, it's also less likely that there will be a very risky family to include in the breeding scheme. And this has been a very successful way also to reduce the risk of feather pecking through breeding. After my PhD, I worked on a postdoc project where I continued some of the research lines from my PhD. This was focusing on the evaluating the effects of the genetic selection on low mortality that I just talked about, and I combined this with a contrast in early life living conditions. And so in this project, we studied birds from the low mortality line and the control line. So this low mortality line was the line that I just described. So here there were birds selected that showed little pecking behavior and low mortality in these group cages. So in general, birds that had a lower pecking motivation compared with the control line that was just random bred without this attention for pecking behavior. Then I had 2 treatments during early life. Half of the birds was reared with a foster mother, as you can see in the picture here on the physiology and behavior. So Chinese silky hens, and half of the birds was reared without a foster mother. And that was for the first 6 weeks of life. So that's also a similar period that the hen would stay caring for the chicks in a natural situation. And then we studied behavioral development, and again also things like fearfulness, feather damage, and wounds. You see some results from the brooded chicks and the non-brooded chicks and the low mortality line versus the control line. So on the left-hand side, you see the control line. On the right-hand side, the low mortality. The dark bars are the brooded chicks, and the green bars are the non-brooded chicks. And we could see that both birds from the low mortality line on the right, that they were more active in the open field at 5 weeks of age, so also less fearful. But also birds brooded by mother, so the dark bars, those birds were also less fearful than the birds that were not brooded. And when we studied the pecking behavior of these birds in a later study, we also saw that both the low mortality line birds and the brooded birds showed less cannibalistic pecking. We had quite some problems with toe pecking in this experiment, and that was much less in the low mortality line and in the brooded birds. Interestingly, this treatment was done in the very early age, so at until 6 weeks of age. And at the end of the experiment, we sacrificed the birds, a subset, and we studied in collaboration with Rebecca Noordquist at Utrecht. We studied the brain morphology of these birds. And then we found that this brooding period of 6 weeks had led to lasting changes in the brain of the birds. And we saw that birds reared with a foster mother had less lateralization in cell size in the hippocampus. And you can see that in the bar graph in the left-hand bottom. The birds with a hen, the chicks that were reared with a hen, they have a lower lateralization in cell size than the birds reared without a hen. And this was, if we looked at the literature, this was similar to an experiment in rodents where they also used the maternal deprivation model. And so this illustrates that this time spent with the hen leads to also changes in brain morphology, and that translates into changes in behavior throughout life. So that's quite interesting to see how strong those effects can be on the bird. After that, we started a large project in the Netherlands on feather pecking when I was working as a researcher at Utrecht University. It was a collaboration with one of the Dutch hatcheries. So the hatchery is the company that owns the parent stock and that rears the birds until 17 weeks of age and then sells them to the laying hen farm. And we were interested to see what are the risk factors for feather pecking on the farm when we look throughout the chain of production. So what is the role of the parent stock? What is the role of the hatchery, the rearing farm, and what happens on the laying farm? So can we predict the risk of feather damage and feather packing on the laying farm by looking at the different parts of the chain? And so we started by looking at the parent stock. This is a commercial Dutch flock of parent stock. For the brown egg market, you can see the brown males and the white females. It looks quite crowded here. That's also because this type of genetics is quite curious. So when you enter the barn, they all come moving towards you. And this is a single tier system, which is quite common for laying hen parent stock. And here we visited these flocks and we studied basal corticosterone levels as a stress measure. We also looked at plumage condition and at fearfulness of these birds. And then later on, we compared that to the offspring from these flocks and followed them into lay. What was interesting to see, this was the PhD research of Elske de Haas, that we did find a relationship between stress in the parent stock and behavior of the chicks, of the offspring. And we only found that in the white flocks. So we followed 50 flocks in total, 25 white and 25 brown. And only in the white parent stock, we found that if the parents had high feather damage, so a lot of feather damage and high basal corticosterone levels, their offspring had an increased risk of already developing severe feather packing in the first week of life. And this is really bad, because if they develop it that early in life, they're unlikely to forget it again. So they will continue to show this severe feather packing behavior. Then they start already very early on in the rearing period, and they will continue in the laying period probably. So this is really something to look at. Can we also improve the management of our parent stock to reduce the risk of feather packing throughout the production chain? So then we visited the rearing farm, and the focus of the project was on the rearing farm. And so we visited those at 1, 5, 10, and 15 weeks of age. Here you see chicks that have just arrived at the rearing farm. So now they are locked into the aviary tier. And at about 4 weeks of age, 5 weeks of age, they are set free in the rearing aviary, and they can explore and move around. What we saw in the rearing farm, so we had 3 visits, week 1, week 5, and week 10, where we studied feather packing behavior in these birds. And we saw a peak in feather packing behavior around week 5. And this was a peak in gentle feather packing, that's the blue line, but also we saw a small peak in severe feather packing. This is also what we expected, because severe feather packing is luckily much less common during early life. There's more behavior that you see in the adult hens, but you see the peak at the same age. And what is interesting is that this 5 weeks of age is also the age at which the birds are normally set free in the system. And of course, it's then also very important that birds have something to explore and to peck at, to show foraging behavior. And so when they are set free from the system very late, or there's no litter available, this will also limit their opportunities to peck at their environment, increasing the risk of feather packing. And indeed, that's something that we saw. So the majority of the rearing flocks that had feather damage already at 5 weeks of age also had problems with litter supply. And on the right-hand side, you can see some pictures from flocks we visited. In some cases, the single tier system on the top, if birds are restricted to the tier there, they don't have any litter access, and that might be a problem. And then the bottom is an aviary system where the birds are set free and there's litter on the floor. So there they have something to forage. Here we also saw a strong effect on feather packing. So if no litter was available, like you see on the left-hand side, there was much more severe feather packing than when litter was available. Again, we saw this was also partly a genetic effect, because we mainly saw this in the brown birds. So that's the Isa brown, the orange bars, and not so much in the white birds, the yellow bars in this figure. That's interesting when you compare the litter. The litter is very important for the brown birds. For the white birds, we saw that managing fearfulness and stress is very important. And so also depending on the chickens you use, you might need to think about different risk factors. In the end, we followed the same flocks from rearing. We followed to the laying farm. We visited them once, also to look at fearfulness during the laying period, feather damage, and behavior during the laying period. So this is a commercial aviary with laying hens that are quite common in the Netherlands. And what we studied there was to see, to look at risk factors for feather damage at 40 weeks of age during the laying period. And we looked at risk factors from all the phases that we had visited. And this is the list of factors that was significant. So we saw that some factors from the rearing period were significant, and that's also something we expected. And so if birds already develop severe feather packing at 5 weeks of age, very early on in the rearing, this is a risk factor for feather damage later in life. Also high fear of humans. So if birds are very reluctant to approach humans during rearing, this is also an indicator that the flock is more prone to develop feather packing later in life. And so that's very useful as an indicator for people to consider providing enrichment or modifying management to prevent the development of feather packing. Also, some factors from the laying period itself were found to be important. There was more feather damage in floor housing rather than aviary housing. There was more feather damage in large group sizes. There was more feather damage in flocks that were also very fearful. But of course, this was measured at the same time at the laying farm. So this could also be caused by the feather packing and the cannibalism. If that can also increase fear in the flock. If you experience pain, for instance. And we also saw that there was more feather damage in flocks that had no modified management. So we had a number of flocks that did have modified management, 9 out of 35 that we included in the final data set. And those flocks were given enrichments, such as you see on the right. For instance, alfalfa bale, so some kind of roughage or hay or straw. Often a radio playing in the house to reduce the stress levels and to get birds adjusted to human voice. Also packing blocks, as you see in the bottom picture, that birds can also like to peck at those, and that will also help to blunt the tip of their beaks. So approaches like that can help to reduce problems of feather packing. So from that project, we concluded that clearly all links of the chain matter in safeguarding hen welfare. Our biggest surprise was the effect of the parent stock also on offspring behavior and feather packing, and that's something that's really not very well studied. So that's really something to take further in the future, and something that we are focusing on now also is also to think more about, can we improve the hatching and rearing environment of the birds? So also at the rearing farm, how can we really favor the good behavioral development of the birds? So in this part, I want to talk a little bit about recent research on the effects of incubation and hatching conditions. And those are projects, for instance, on light during incubation, also noise around hatching, and environmental enrichment in early life. So here you see a picture from a commercial hatchery. And that's, you're probably familiar with this. So large numbers of eggs in these trays being incubated in a very efficient way. But of course, it's very far from this picture, where the hen is sitting on 8 to 10 eggs, incubating them herself, sometimes leaving the nest. So it's interesting to think about that. Are there aspects of this situation that you could also translate to industrial conditions, and could that improve, for instance, offspring development or behavior? One aspect that we have been quite interested in is light during incubation, because it's known that the mother hen also leaves the nest during incubation. There's some really nice work from Archer and Mensch from the US that included, and you can see that in the right-hand figure, a data logger inside a plastic ball in the nest that had a light intensity logger. And so every time the mother would leave the eggs, it would record exposure to light. And in the bottom hand, you can see the number of bouts of when the eggs were exposed to light. So there's quite some variation in light exposure on the eggs, whereas in commercial practice, eggs are often incubated or always incubated in the dark. And they worked mainly with broiler chickens, where they compared chicks that had either been incubated in the dark or with a 12-hour light, 12-hour dark schedule. And they found that these broilers that were incubated with a light schedule were less sensitive to stress. And they came up with two explanations for this phenomenon. It could either be the earlier onset of daily rhythms for hormones such as melatonin and corticosterone. It could also be increased brain lateralization because in the end of the incubation period, the chick is facing with a specific eye towards the eggshell, and when then that eye receives a lot of light, it will stimulate brain lateralization. But they found actually the strongest effects of continuous exposure to light, also before the time that brain lateralization really plays a role. So actually, this first mechanism, the effect on the onset of the hormonal rhythms, seems to be the more likely explanation for their results. Also in laying hens, there's been some work on light exposure. Quite early on, Bernd Rietstra and Tom Groothuis, they studied the effect of exposure to white light. They saw some increased gentle feather packing in young chicks. Also, Sezen Özkan's group in Turkey has done quite a lot of work in this area, and they also found that light color during incubation can play a role. And they used the 12-hour light, 12-hour dark light schedule, but they compared darkness with white light and green light, and they found with regard to feather packing that white light increased feather packing, similar to what Rietstra and Groothuis found, but that green light, as you can also see in the pictures, reduced feather packing compared with darkness. And that's a topic that we also continued in Utrecht. And so those are some results from the PILLOW project, focusing on welfare of poultry and pigs from free-range and organic conditions. Saskia Kliphuis is working on that topic in the group in Utrecht. And she's focusing on ways to reduce the risk of feather packing by providing light during incubation, also by providing enrichment after hatching. So she's also using insect feeding during the rearing period to see how this is affecting the birds. And so she's optimizing the early life environment to reduce fearfulness and feather packing, resulting in more resilient birds. So she has this green light dark cycle during incubation and hatching, and then half of the birds from each light treatment, they get a provision of larvae as enrichment during rearing. She performed 2 rounds of experiments doing different behavior tests, home pen observations, and she collected physiological data. And at the bottom, you can see the 4 treatments. And so we have light with no larvae, light with larvae, dark with larvae, and dark with no larvae. And then she compared behavioral development of these 4 treatments. She did quite a test battery that you can see here in the overview. And so the 2 rounds are shown separately. The first round was during the first COVID outbreak. So then the number of tests had to be limited. The second round, she was able to do all kinds of tests below. I will not go into detail, but just to give you an overview of the different tests we used. And happy to talk about if you're interested to use any of these tests in the future. Here are some pictures from the experiment. So the novel object test in the top left-hand corner, the tonic immobility test in the top right-hand, blood samples, and this is home pen observations and one of the fear tests in a different arena. And this is the open field test. Well, what are her first findings? She's still busy with developing this and publishing this. On the whole, she found that the effects of the light incubation on fearfulness were rather limited. She did find a difference in this voluntary human approach test. So this is a test where the human is crouching in the test arena and providing some feed and some grains on the hand, and some feed that the birds really like, and then we measure how fast the birds approach the human. And there we did see that light incubated birds approach the human faster than the dark incubated birds. And you can also see this on the right hand side in the survival plot, where the purple line is light incubated and the green line is light incubated. And the average of those two, the light treatment, they were faster to approach the human than the dark incubated birds. She also studied the effect on feather pecking. In general, feather pecking levels were quite low in the study, so we saw hardly any severe feather pecking, and we did not see differences in feather pecking between the treatments. We did see a difference between the rounds, and that we had much more feather pecking in the first round than in the second round. So here you see the number of gentle feather pecks in the 4 treatments. There were no significant differences here. If we look at foraging behavior, we were providing the groups that received the larvae, they got a cylinder where the larvae were slowly dropping out when they manipulated the tube. And there we did see that larvae enrichment led to more frequent foraging behavior than birds, compared with birds that did not receive the larvae. So they were stimulated to show more foraging bouts. And so again, here the purple and the green are the groups that received the larvae, and they had a higher average of foraging bouts than the other groups. In some instances, we also found a round effect. That's not so relevant for the treatments, of course. We saw this difference in feather pecking. That's also reflected in feather damage. As you can see in the figure here, the round 1, there was more feather damage than in round 2, where the majority of the birds is score 0 or score 1. So that was a difference. And of course, there's a time difference between rounds, so there can be many explanations for effects like this. But it's important to include them in the model. And to summarize this part, Saskia found minor effects of the treatments on behavior. We did see that light during incubation reduced fear of humans in the voluntary human approach test, and that larvae provisioning slightly increased foraging behavior. And larvae provisioning did not affect fearfulness or feather pecking. We saw these round effects in some tests, and in some cases we had some restrictions due to COVID-19. So she will continue analyzing those results and presenting them further. And the birds that we had in Utrecht for rearing afterwards went to Ilvo in Belgium for the laying phase, and there they are studied in a free-range system where we also have sensors on them so that we can look at their individual free-range use. So that will be quite interesting to also follow up this part of the project. Another aspect that I quickly wanted to talk about was the effect of noise during incubation. You may know that the hatcher is quite a noisy environment. I think that the sound is not working. This is a sound of a commercial hatcher. And it's quite a loud background noise that almost covers the vocalizations that the birds are making around hatching. And also, while they are still in the egg, they're also already communicating with each other. And so when they are in a very noisy environment, because of the fans and the valves of the machine, this can hamper chick communication. So they cannot communicate, while in nature they would synchronize their hatching by vocalizing during hatching and making these pipping sounds, and later on after hatching the vocalizations. So we expect that this noise around hatching can lead to a larger hatch window, so a longer time before the first and the last chick hatch, and also more variation in chick quality. And you can imagine that a very noisy environment can also be stressful for the chicks that hatch early. And so in this study, we investigate the effect of light during incubation and noise around hatching. And we study this on the effect on cognitive bias in adult laying hens. And so I'll explain the cognitive bias test in a minute, but it's really trying to ask animals how they are experiencing their environment. And if they have been in very stressful conditions before, this could translate in a more pessimistic, more negative cognitive bias. And so our expectations were that the light treatment would lead to faster development and maybe to birds that were less stress sensitive. The quiet environment would lead to a smaller hatch window and better social behavior. The combination we expected to be the best, so light during incubation and a quiet environment, that those birds would have better behavioral development and welfare, and that they would show an optimistic response in this cognitive bias test. So a little something about the methods. So again, we had this 2x2 design with the light and the noise. So during day 1 to 16, we had either dark or light exposure, 12 hours dark, 12 hours light, with white light in this case. And around hatching, from day 17 until 21, birds or eggs were placed either in a noisy environment, so commercial hatcher recorded 85 decibels, or a quiet environment with around 60 decibels. And then we studied the effect of hatching, comparing the high noise and the low noise environment. Here in the top left-hand corner, you can see the percentage of chicks hatched. And in the low noise, you can see that the chicks started to hatch sooner than in the high noise. So it affected the hatching results. Also, if you look at hatching weight in the top right, you can see that the hatching weight for the low noise was higher than for the high noise environment. So it also affected the weight of the chicks. If you then look at vocalization patterns in the bottom picture, you can see that especially for the Twitter vocalizations on the right-hand side, birds adapted their vocalization, and so the frequency was higher in the high noise treatment than in the low noise treatment. So this is evidence that birds were trying to shout over the noise to still be heard by the other birds. We did not see this difference in the peeping vocalization, which is more similar to the stress call. But it's probably also because this can also be it's easier to get over the noise with this vocalization than with the Twitter. This is the same data in a slightly different visualization. So on the top you see the frequency, the amplitudes. On the left hand, the quiet environment. On the right hand side, noisy environment. So you can see that the birds were vocalizing much louder in the noisy environment. You see it also, the different vocalizations. So the peeps and the twitters in the bottom picture, in the quiet environment and in the noisy environment. And you can, in the bottom picture, you can really see that these twitters are very close to the noise in the noisy environment, so very difficult to hear for the other birds. These birds were adults. We did a cognitive bias test with them, modeled on a study by Hernandez and colleagues from Australia, where we had this maze that you can see in the picture. Birds were trained to walk from the start box to a food reward, and this food reward was always placed on the same side of the arena for them. And of course, we balanced this across birds. And so they were trained that, for instance, when the feeder is on the right, it is rewarded. When the feeder is on the left, it is not rewarded. And so at some point, they really get this trick, and they know when to approach and when not to approach. So it's a go, no-go task, as we call it. And once they've learned the trick, you can place the feeder in ambiguous locations. So either in the center or closer to the unrewarded side, or closer to the rewarded side. And then we had a session with 12 trials where we basically mixed the rewarded trials, the unrewarded trials, and the ambiguous trials, similar to a study used by Oliver Berman in dogs, reference at the bottom. So here you can see the latency to approach in the different placements of the feeder. So on the left-hand side, the unrewarded, on the right-hand side, the rewarded side. And you can see that according to expectations, birds respond quite well to the location of the feeder. So the closer the feeder is to the rewarded side, the more likely the bird is to approach the feeder. When it's at 50% or 75%, they're still quite likely to move. When it is either at the unrewarded side or very close to the unrewarded side, they are unlikely to move. Birds needed about 13 sessions to reach the training criterion, and in this measurement we did not find treatment effects. But when we compare the response to the ambiguous cue, so this 25, 50% and 75% treatment, we had an effect of noise by light interaction. And we found that birds from the light noise treatment were more pessimistic. So they would be very unlikely to move at the 25%, close to the unrewarded side, and also unlikely to move at the 50% location. And so this shows that birds from this group had a more pessimistic judgment bias than birds from the other treatments. This was a bit unexpected because it's the combination of light and noise. We were expecting this mainly from the noise treatment. One hypothesis that we've had since then is that the light might have led to a more speedy development of these chicks, what we also saw in other parts of the study. And that could have led to the fact that they were also more sensitive to the noise treatment around hatching. But quite interesting to find this effect also quite long after the hatching treatment had taken place. Similar studies have recently also been done, for instance, by Louise Hedlund in Sweden. And they also confirm that the hatchery and the procedures at the hatchery are quite stressful for the birds. Here you see birds, comparing birds from hatchery hatched, the white bars, and eggs from the same batch hatched at the university, and then subjected to a stress test, a restraint test, and you can see a much stronger response in the hatchery hatched birds than in the birds that did not have this stressor. And that also translated in their case to damage and injuries, where they also saw more damage in the hatchery hatched birds than in the birds hatched at the university. And so this is also an area that we can really look into. How can we improve incubation and hatching conditions, early life conditions, to also reduce stress and favor good behavioral development in this phase. Okay, to summarize this set of effects, this set of studies, so we looked at light during incubation. Although the results in the broilers were very strong, in our case the results were relatively limited. We did find some positive effects on reducing fearfulness. We looked at noise around hatching, where we found negative effects on stress levels and damaging behavior. And we also saw this negative, this pessimistic cognitive bias in birds from the light noise treatment. And we've looked at environmental enrichment in early life, where it helped to stimulate foraging, but it did not affect other aspects in the study within the Pillow project. A bit more general at some of the developments that we see in the world. If we look at, of course, I'm a little bit EU-centered, being from Europe. In Europe, there's currently a lot of discussion on the future of egg production, and we've had this petition End the Cage Age, where NGOs and society are asking the EU to move away from cage systems for farm animals. And the EU Parliament has adopted this petition. So there's a lot of interest at the moment in thinking about stimulating cage-free systems. The welfare legislation is being revised next year. And then it's also expected that the discussion on cage housing, including furnished cages for laying hens, will move into a next stage and perhaps also to a full cage ban in Europe. Also, beak trimming is being debated in many countries. So also the percentage of hens with intact beaks is expected to increase in the future. So there we also really need from the science side to support farmers and to support industry in making this transition in a way that is sustainable for them, and also avoiding a lot of welfare problems when this type of transitions is not going in the right way. So we need attention throughout the breeding chain and throughout the production chain to minimize the risk of feather packing. And as I showed, there's already a lot of knowledge and information available, and this is also taken into account by the industry partners. We see that experience with management of hens in non-cage systems is increasing in Europe and also in other parts of the world. For instance, also Australia, US, Canada, but also in Asia, there's several initiatives, and basically worldwide there are initiatives for starting with non-cage systems. So there's a lot of interest in this topic at the moment. And then, of course, it's important to think about management advice and housing advice that can lead to improved performance and reduced mortality levels. This is from a recent study by Sjouk Paim and colleagues looking into the relationship between housing system and mortality in laying hens. This is showing the percentage of cage-free worldwide. So green is cage-free and red is cage. And you can see that in many areas of the world there is a percentage of cage-free. Of course, there's variation there between different countries. One aspect that has always been criticized regarding cage-free is the perceived higher percentage of mortality in cage-free compared to cage. And then you can have the argument, well, if there's higher mortality, how can it be better welfare? So that is something that Sjouk Paim and colleagues addressed in this review study. They analyzed a large data set, over 6,000 flocks, 176 million hens from 16 countries, and they compared mortality in conventional cages, furnished cages, and cage-free systems. In the figures on the right, the conventional are the red dots, furnished cages, the yellow dots, and cage-free, the blue dots. And what they saw was that there was a trend in general of mortality decreasing with increasing farmer experience. So it's very important that farmers learn to work with these cage-free systems. And then you can see a decrease of 0.35 to 0.65% mortality per year. So that's quite significant. And if you then look at countries that already have a long history in cage-free production, such as France and the Netherlands, here on the right-hand side, you can see that, especially if you look closer to the right-hand side of the figure, mortality is not significantly different between cage systems and cage-free systems. And so it's more about experience of working with the system rather than an effect of the housing system itself. That's important to realize. Since then, we've also had other workshops to discuss the transition to cage-free. One of the workshops was at the ISE Congress in 2021. It was an online workshop where we also discussed how can we move forward on this topic of cage-free? How can we work together as researchers with the industry, with the farmers, the retailers, consumers? What role do the governments play, NGOs, farmer experience? You can see it in this complex figure that we included in the paper, and where we also said, well, clearly everyone has its own role to play. We should also stimulate knowledge exchange between these parties, and start this conversation about problems that people are facing in making transitions and in making steps forward. And so for the workshop, we had repeated twice. And so in total, we had 80 participants from 27 different countries, really international. The majority were scientists, but the workshop also included egg producers, governmental organizations, and NGOs, so non-governmental organizations. The delegates agreed that we need a greater education and dissemination of technical knowledge. But also people were able to think of successful examples of cage-free systems in a range of different countries. We also had presentations from India, for instance, also experience from Europe, from other parts of the world. So as was also shown in the world map, in many areas of the world, this type of ideas are investigated. But people also stress that we need to collaborate with all the actors involved. A recent study that's also interesting, and the scientists from this group in Nigeria were also included, Dr. Yassere, in the Sinclair paper that's recently published, also looking at, okay, if we look outside of Europe, because in Europe there's a lot of focus on cage-free, but how is it outside of Europe? So they looked at 14 geographically and culturally diverse countries that are listed here, and interviewed a large number of consumers on, do you actually know where your eggs are coming from? Do you care where your eggs are coming from? And some of these countries are very large egg producers, like you see in the right-hand figure: China, India, USA, Brazil. They have a huge laying hen population, so it's very useful to also think about those type of countries when talking about these developments. And then they found that most participants stated that it matters to them that hens do not suffer in the process of producing the eggs, and also that most would prefer, to varying degrees, to purchase eggs from eggs not kept in cages. That's of course very important when you also consider transitioning, that also the market is there, that people are willing to maybe pay a little bit more for eggs from cage-free systems, because the market is one of the main driving forces in these transitions. So very useful to have studies like this investigating this type of aspects worldwide. In Europe, we're currently also running the Best Practice Hens project. This is a pilot project to support the transition to cage-free systems for laying hens. We started in 21, we'll finish in 23. What we do within this project is not a research project, it's really about collecting knowledge and sharing knowledge. So we are describing best practices for the management of laying hens in cage-free systems. This is based on experiences from EU countries that already have a high percentage of cage-free housing, and those are the Netherlands, Germany, France, and Denmark. And then we make this knowledge available in this experience the two countries where the majority of the hens is still in cages. And in the first part of this project, that is focusing on Spain, Portugal, Poland, and Belgium. So that we can also support the transition in these countries. And of course, the knowledge will also become available to other countries that are interested. So it will be shared widely so that people can benefit from best practices. And of course, also add best practices from other countries, because it's important to share and to also adapt this type of information to local conditions. So to conclude, we saw that, I also see that I'm in time, almost finishing. That's good. And so we saw that scientific research is important to address problems in practice, but then we also need to translate it to commercial conditions and engage with producers and engage with governments to really take this forward. There's a wealth of knowledge on causes of feather pecking and cannibalism that can be used to reduce problems in practice, and it applies both to cage-free housing systems, but also to flocks with intact beaks. And from what I've shown, probably you agree that incubation, hatching, and early life environment play a very important role in behavioral development, and that should also be an area of future study. With that, I would like to thank you very much for your attention, and I'm open to any questions that you may have.
Thank you very much for the wonderful, comprehensive, and full of knowledge. This is a whole lot that you have poured out to us this afternoon, and we have lots of questions for you in the chat box. And firstly, I'll just ask this, it's on a lighter note. What made you get interested in animal behavior and welfare?
Yeah, that's a good question. My family has an agricultural background, so as a small boy, I always liked to help on the farm and feed the pigs and the sheep and the chickens and the cows. It was a mixed farm, so that was where it really started, I think. But then I started studying biology, and once I got education about animal behavior and studying animal behavior, I really got excited by that. And during my master study, I already did a project with laying hens, and since then I've always been a big fan of chickens. So they also stayed with me, although at the moment I'm also working at a wider range of species. But they also call me still the chicken doctor in the Netherlands. So,
yeah, the chicken doctor, yes. That's good. Yeah, so I'll start taking the questions from the chat box. Samuel Durosharo asked, we are clamoring for cage-free housing system for laying hens. How do we reduce the issues of feather pecking, cannibalism, heel bone fractures, and other associated issues with cage-free housing system?
Yeah, I think partly by thinking of innovations that can help to reduce those problems. For keel bone fractures, that's a relatively new topic that we are talking about, and there's some innovations also in terms of adding ramps and platforms in the aviary systems to make it safer for the birds to move through the system. Also, breeding plays a role. So there's also indications that things like onset of egg laying might play a role in keel bone fractures. In the end, I think if I compare cage systems to cage-free, I think both have their challenges, but I think there's more scope to address the issues that we see in the cage-free systems compared to what we can do in the cage systems, because I think in the end, the behavioral restriction of the cage systems, that's something you can never really solve. Whereas problems like feather pecking, cannibalism, also if you look at the historic data on the mortality in the cage-free, that you can see when you have experience with those type of systems, you can reduce this type of risk, and you can have early indications that you have to do something, maybe provide some enrichment, maybe. So I think your opportunities to address challenges with your management are better for the cage-free systems.
Yeah. Then what are the different forms of cage-free systems that we have?
Yeah, so most common would be the single-tier systems for laying hens. So like I showed for the breeders, so where you have a floor system basically with a platform in the middle where the feed and the water and the nests are located. That's the traditional system in Europe. And then the multi-tier system, and that's now becoming the more dominant system, I would say, because it also mimics a bit more the life of a bird, going up in the night to rest on the perch, coming down to eat and drink and forage. So in that sense, the aviary system is better able to provide different functional areas for the birds. And then in both cases, of course, both for the single tier and the multi-tier, they can be combined with a free range access where the birds can also go outside. And sometimes you also see smaller systems like mobile housing, where, for instance, a flock of a few hundred birds is kept, and then the birds can go outside of the mobile house for foraging. But the most common systems are the single tier and the multi-tier, at least in Europe.
Okay. Thank you so much. From Saeed Sabiet, he said, thank you for the interesting talk. He wants to know if there is any effect of acoustic stimuli, enrichment, or visual stimuli, such as the use of mirrors. Can it be used to distract the birds from displaying feather pecking? The use of acoustic stimuli and visual stimuli.
Yeah, acoustic stimuli with regard to feather pecking, I don't think have been really studied. They have been studied in other contexts, for instance, mimicking maternal care or providing some maternal vocalization, stuff like that. But that could be an interesting area to look at. Visual stimuli, there has been work on different types of enrichment. In the end, it seems that something that the birds can really manipulate, like some string or some straw or some alfalfa hay, and maybe even eat, that they get some extra fiber, for instance. Yeah, that's something that's really working. So something they can destroy and they can work with. That's something they really like. So things like CDs and that has also been tried, but that's maybe for a few hours, but that's not really doing anything, to my opinion. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Samuel Doroshara also wants to know, are there ways of in-ovo enrichment methods for poultry apart from the use of music?
In-ovo enrichment.
During the developmental stage?
Yeah. You could see the light in that perspective. There's also work on temperature profiles to think about how does incubation temperature affect resilience after hatching. Some work on this in broilers, for instance. Otherwise, I think the most well-known is the use of auditory signals, so either playing vocalizations or reducing the noise, like I showed. Those would be the only ones that I can think of.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. And the question goes on, what do you think will be the relationship between chicken behavior and microbiome? What's the relationship?
That's an interesting one. Yeah, we did, Jerine van der Eyck did a PhD project on that topic, where we studied birds from the high and low feather pecking lines that I also talked about, selected by Jürgen Kjaer in Denmark. And there we did study the microbiome of these lines, and we found a consistent difference in microbiome composition. That also suggests a relationship between the two. So that's a very interesting question. Jerine also did a transplantation of microbiota from one line to the other. And then she also saw that she could indeed change the behavior and the personality of the birds by this transplantation. So in that sense, it is really important in influencing stress physiology, immunology. So if the person is interested, I'm happy to send the links to those papers. But it's a whole lecture in itself almost.
Thank you, Bas, for answering that question. We have Anna Olsen in our midst, and thank you for joining us. And she wants to know, she said, Bas, this is a very interesting presentation. And she said you mentioned problems with litter supply as a risk factor for feather pecking in the study on commercial farms. Were these systems meant to have litters, but with supply problem preventing this, or the system that by definition weren't using litters?
Yeah, so it was really up to the farmer how they manage their farm. So we did not influence them, but luckily we had about half of them that had a good litter supply and half of them that did not. So in that sense, we could study it quite well. And those that did not, they either did not use chick paper in the cages. So you can put paper on the cage floor so that litter can accumulate there with the chicks, and then they have something to manipulate when they're still locked in the aviary. And when they are set free, some farmers supply like wood shavings on the floor, for instance, and other farmers do not or very little. And we saw that those that had restriction in litter access had the most problems with feather packing.
Oh, wow. Yes, on that issue of litter quality, I also wanted to ask if feather packing has been linked to litter type.
Yeah, not so much. There's been some fundamental work on preferences of birds for different litter types for specific behaviors. Of course, what's normally the case in practice is that the litter is actually a mixture of dried feces with some wood shavings or some other material, some feed. So in general, the litter is not that exciting, I would say, in practice. But still, if it's dry and friable and the birds can dust bathe in it and forage in it, they will still do so. I think it is something, especially in more commercial context, it would be something for the future to think more about. And I think at the moment there's also projects looking into effects of different litter depths. Like, should it be 5 centimeters, 10 centimeters? Sometimes you have half a meter. What is the most? What is the best for the birds? Also looking at dust levels. That might also be a health issue both for the birds and for the farmer. So it's
A whole lot to investigate.
Yeah.
In the flock of laying hens, I think we can actually categorize them into 3. We have maybe the peckers, the victims, and the neutral. So I was just wondering, is because from the little I know about feather pecking is that it starts gradually and then it spreads in the flock. So does it have to do with social learning as well? Or is it that there are some that are early, they start pecking early, and others join this behavior later? Or does it have to do with social learning within the group?
It's a good question. There has been some work on this a long time ago. And then the evidence for social learning was not so strong, both for cannibalistic pecking and for feather pecking. And also sort of I think the bird that I showed in the movie, those are really the obsessive compulsive feather packers that they will continue to show this throughout their life probably. But we've also seen cases where sort of the pattern was not so clear. And then like Courtney Daigle did a postdoc project with us, and she found actually that birds that are pecker in the 1 week were neutral in the 2nd week and victim in the 3rd week. So it was not so clear. So in general, I think we also still don't really understand this yet. One thing that we do know, and that's from research from Tina McKeddy from a long time ago, is that, for instance, damage, feather damage can be attractive to other birds to peck at, because birds are very perceptive to birds that are different, that have some feathers standing out, for instance, and then it will attract other birds to peck at this. And the same goes for wounded birds. If they see blood or they see, that's very attractive to join in and to to finish the job.
Thank you so much. Samuel Doroshari is asking, in what way can maternal care be simulated in commercial poultry production?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So we've also discussed this. I think one of the most promising directions at the moment is the dark brooders. So to supply the chicks with a sort of artificial mother, a dark area where they can rest while the active birds are moving around. Because this has been shown by Anja Rieber in the past as a very powerful tool to reduce the risk of feather pecking. It's also applied by some rearing companies, like one in the UK that's using this in mobile houses. So I think the dark brooder is a clear result that's ready for application in practice. Otherwise, I have also discussed with more small-scale farmers that were really excited to use also foster mothers, but it is a huge job, and it's not that realistic for these huge flock sizes that we use in practice. Other things could be things related to scent or vocalizations or some aspects of the mother, trying to translate that to practice.
Thank you so much. Said also is asking here, could you please let me know what was your noise treatment properties in terms of the frequency range, temporal pattern, continuous or intermittent pattern?
Yeah, the sound didn't play, did it? Or the
No,
sound? No. I can just imitate it, but I'm also happy to send it to him later on. But the headshare is really like this. It's really a sound like this, and it's continuous. It's very loud, and it's very difficult for the chicks to make themselves heard in these conditions.
Continuous for like how many hours?
Yeah, so basically this was like in practice, it was when the bird moved to the hatcher from 17 days until hatching, 21 days, this noise was playing continuously. Yes. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
And I have to look up the technical details.
I probably need to prepare our minds that we may likely exceed the time because the questions just keep, coming in. And I would love us to exhaust it so that a lot of people would benefit from this discussion. Akinyele Adeshenwa says, nice presentation for a time like this in this part of the world as a way of advocacy and sensitization towards a future adoption of cage-free systems for laying hen. Thank you. What are the steps? Okay, we need to step this down of technologies to farmers to adopt. Okay, thank you so much for that comment. Now, Miriam Loguleka is asking, do you think higher body weight is a risk factor for feather pecking?
In the past, there have been some relationships found between body weight and feather pecking. I think the strongest relationship was with onset of egg laying. So birds that have an earlier onset of egg laying, so early maturation, they had an increased risk to develop feather pecking. So that might be a trait to keep an eye on. And also the breeding companies are at the moment not so focused on early onset of egg laying. So they now focus more on extended production periods. So that's, I think, a good thing because several studies have found this relationship between early maturity and feather pecking.
Yeah, oh, that's amazing. Yeah, a question here from Lucas. He says, that's a wonderful presentation and very insightful. Have you come across any links between keelbone fractures and hen fearfulness?
I'm not sure about fearfulness. There are studies from Bristol on Mohammed Nasser studied there the relationship with pain, and then showing that hens with keelbone fractures were more likely to seek out analgesia when available. So showing that they are in pain. For fearfulness, I'm not sure. We did look at this ourselves in a small study, and then we did not find a clear relationship. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Of course, the research will continue to go on and on and on and on. We can't solve all the problem in one day.
No.
There's a question from Victor Yenero. He said, nice presentation, Bas. You noted that cage-free lead to higher mortalities. How can these be reduced?
So that's, I think I already showed that. So this was always this was something that people always stated, and I think this review study shows that in fact cage systems have been around for a long time. Cage-free systems have been developed more recently, so the difference seems more to be related to the experience we have with the system, rather than that it's really a trait of the system itself. So from the results from France and the Netherlands, for instance, we see that mortality rates can be as low as in cage systems, in non-cage systems. Then, of course, it's important that you manage to avoid major issues with feather pecking cannibalism, for instance.
Oh, yeah. Bas, I want to, it's still part of this discussion because there is a question here. The person is saying, Karim Adetula is saying the major challenge now in Nigeria, it has to do with the cost of poultry feed, as well as biosecurity to improve productivity. Animal welfare, one of the freedom is that the animals should have access to feed. But in a situation where economic instability and the price of the feed keeps skyrocketing, what do you think can be done? How can farmers manage this? Because this is their business and this is what they do for a living.
Yeah. We see it in Europe at the moment as well. Also with the Ukraine war, and that is really affecting the world markets in animal feed. Luckily, also the egg prices are increasing, and there's also a shortage of eggs at the moment, so that is helping. I think that's one of the major challenges, right? So also transition to cage-free, that also depends on the market asking for this type of products. And I think it's also important to show that cage-free production is not that much more expensive than cage production. So also highlighting aspects like that. But the market has to be ready for it. And if there's, if the market is focused on as cheap production as possible, then it doesn't make sense to start transitioning. So that's and we have the same discussion in Europe at the moment. When we enhance animal welfare, will there be a consumer that's willing to pay for this? At the moment, we see that people in the supermarket also try to buy the cheapest products available, because they see the prices are rising, and I'm curious to see how this will develop after the Ukraine war has ended, and how the future is looking regarding availability of feedstuffs and availability of other materials. It's
That's a big
complex times that we are living in.
Yeah, there's always a problem to solve. I was just wondering if you've come across any paper or any research that have compared a free-range system and indoor housed like poultry production system as regarding the feed consumption level. Probably this might be a way out, to cut down on the amount of feed that the animals consume.
So we know that the feed efficiency is higher in cage systems than in cage-free systems, because the birds are active, they are moving around, and they also need energy to do that. So in that sense, if you want to save feed, then the cage is the way to go. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much, Bas. Then we have Alain Gasco. She said, thank you for your presentation. My question is about any current work you might be doing with chicken calls and automation. Do you have any ongoing research on chicken calls and automation?
We're just starting in that area, so I don't have really any results yet to share, but we are very interested also in the recent publications on vocalizations and how they might say something about affective state of the animal. But that's really an area that we are, as a group, we are starting in. So the work that we've been doing mainly on automation and sensor approaches has mainly focused on animal tracking, activity monitoring, also using computer vision to recognize specific behaviors. So that's an area that we're quite active in, for instance, pigs and in poultry, and also linking, for instance, activity patterns to health of the animals, behavior of the animals. So that's an area that I'm more experienced in.
Yeah, I think she's actually interested in that area. And she's also trying to ask if you have any current partner in Brazil investigating lean hen welfare with you.
At the moment, I don't, but that might change in the near future then.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think I've exhausted the question in the chat box. At this point, I would like the participants, you're free to turn on your video. And if you have further comments or anything to discuss further that you think we need to discuss further, then you still have, we have the opportunity to do that in just 5 minutes before we end today's meeting. Please feel free to turn on your video and, your video, yes. And if you have further comments, indicate by raising up of your hand, using the button, and then you will be called. Please, also in the chat box, I dropped in a link to the first regional meeting of the ISAE Africa West Asia region. It will be coming up on the 1st and 2nd of December. The time for abstract submission is closed, but you can still register for the meeting. It's going to be an interesting one. It is the first meeting of the ISA Africa and West Asia, and we have loads of activities, outlined for the 2 days. We have 4 plenary talks and we have oral presentation, and this is mainly to encourage the upcoming researchers so we can guide them to the right path and things like that. We'll be having a talk on career opportunities in animal behavior and welfare, and also how to seek or get academic related career in overseas if you are in this area of specialization. We'll also be talking about how to publish your journals or manuscripts, articles in high impact journal. We'll be having a virtual video farm tour. So please kindly check the chat box and register for this event. It promises to be exciting. Thank you. And the Animal Behavior Live is also having a free meeting tomorrow and the next tomorrow. Please also in the chat box, the link is there. Kindly be part of this event. Yeah, do we have any comments? Anybody? Okay, Samuel Durosharo. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Bas. That was a nice presentation, and I wrote a lot of things, a lot of things. I was just wondering, I saw something that Dr. Yasere skipped that I put as question. I saw something on a vaccination recovery test. How do you do that and for what purpose?
Yeah, there was a little bit of a chance finding, but we observed that when the birds were treated with a spray vaccination, when we returned them to their pens, there was quite some variation in how long the birds took to recover in their behavior. So how long does it take for the group to show normal behavior again? So when we observed that there was quite some variation between groups, how they how stressed they were by the whole procedure, by being handled and being vaccinated and returned to the pen, we decided to collect data on this. And we labeled this the vaccination recovery test. Yeah.
Oh, that was interesting. And I also saw that you have a lot of collaborations with industries for your work, Hendrix and some other Dutch farmers. How did you achieve this?
Yeah, there's quite a history in the Netherlands and in Europe, I think, also for collaboration with industry partners. The industry also has often questions that they would like help with, and they would be interested in research that is focusing on this area. For instance, the breeding companies, they want to know, how can we breed animals for the housing systems of the future? So sometimes this type of collaboration starts quite small, maybe with a master student or with a student project. And once this really works well, and you are able to answer some questions and to move forward, these collaborations can grow also. Of course, it's always important to also think about that the science should also be the science, so not just trying to answer very practical questions, or and sometimes it may also be that the answers are not fitting to the industry, or so that can also lead to discussions, of course. But in general, I find it very valuable to discuss and to work with them, but also with government and with NGOs, to really see, how can we also address societal problems.
Yeah, Bas, yeah. Are you through?
No, just one question. Like we discussed during the interview session, three entities are involved now: the government, which is into policy making, the people in academics and research, which are into research. Then we have the industry, which I think they are interested in profit making. So how do you as a researcher or academic, how do you convince these two other people so that the industries will not miss out in their profit, and government will not see you as someone that just to publish papers?
Yeah, that's a good question. And of course, in the end, you are separate entities. So I'm not I'm not hired to solve the challenges of the industry, or to help the politicians directly to have a certain decision. Some decisions are up to policymakers, and also for industry. In the end, we are about providing the scientific knowledge, answering scientific questions, and helping all parties interested in improving animal welfare with how they can do that, how they can measure it, what a housing system should look like. But if you talk about transitions, for instance, animal husbandry, how fast those are going, if we are switching to cage-free, to intact beaks, in the end, that's also up to policymakers and to society and to industry. So we are not. I don't see myself as the main driver in that discussion. We can say what the animal needs, and we can look at the system from the animal's perspective. And of course, there are certain practices where we might say this is not acceptable for the animal. But in general, I think those type of decisions are up to the society we belong to.
Thank you so much. That is all for now, Dr. Yasin.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I can't see anybody indicating that they have a comment for you. I want to sincerely appreciate you, Professor Bas, for taking time out to give us this knowledge-packed lecture this afternoon. Thank you so much. On behalf of the Animal Welfare Group Nigeria, I say a very big thank you. And I also want to thank all the participants for taking time to be part of today's meeting. Lucille Dementia, thank you so much. Alain, Gideon, Said, Azadeh Jalila, thank you so much. Noveluta Pizza, thank you so much. Akinyele Adeshanyiwa, thank you for joining. Jeze Oluwaseun Ayantoye, we appreciate you. Miriam Kiani, Hita Alizade, sorry. Thank you for being part of today's meeting. Moyiwa Fatola, Marcus Peter, and Oluwatosin. I think half of them have left after your presentation, but I want to appreciate everybody. And with this, I say thank you and have a lovely day wherever you are. And bye-bye.
Thank you. Yeah. Bye.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Good to see you.
Thank you.